Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the third day of the 6-day series of the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum and Convocation Series. This year, our journey through time is in search of the human spirit. We have two wonderful programs today, starting with our keynote speaker this morning. Our guest, Dr. Clay Jenkinson, is a Rhodes Scholar and former professor of Ancient Studies at the University of Nevada at Reno. He is recognized as the premier scholar on the life and times of Thomas Jefferson. Yet he's here this morning to give a keynote address. He addressed President Jefferson yesterday. Jenkinson has performed before Presidents Bush and Clinton, the President's Cabinet, members of Congress, and international organizations. He was awarded the National Endowment for the Humanities Charles Frankel Prize by President George Bush for his outstanding work in the humanities. Our guest has an outstanding record as a historian and Chautauqua performer. As a matter of fact, the Idaho Humanities Council has recognized his work by giving us a grant for this series for the past 6 years, and he has been with us those 6 years. I had the privilege and opportunity over the last 24 hours to discuss with Dr. Jenkinson his keynote address today. I predict that upon hearing his address, that your life will be altered, and particularly you who are young, he will challenge you in a way that you have never been challenged before. I think many of you will do some special things in life, and he will be assisting with your energy and your determination. His address today is being ready when the moment comes. Join me in welcoming to our program Dr. Clay Jenkinson.
Well, good morning, everyone. I know I can't do all of that. So my moment has come, and I'm sure I'm not ready. Just a couple of quick announcements before I move into the substance of my talk. Some people have been asking me how they can obtain copies of my book on Meriwether Lewis, and you can go to Amazon.com if you want and just type in my name or Lewis and Clark, or you can, there are brochures out in the lobby, and there's my own website, and you can go there. And also some have been asking me about cultural tours that I lead. I lead cultural tours to Monticello. There will be one in late May, to Jefferson's, Virginia, that is. I lead tours to Jefferson's, France, and Greece. And recently I've been doing Lewis and Clark cultural tours here in Idaho in the Bitterroot Mountains. And if you're interested, again, go to my website, or there are brochures out in the lobby. So enough of all of that. Let me just tell you how delighted I am to be back at North Idaho College. I look forward to this every year. It's a place that I feel at home in. I have friends here, and I feel that I can come and try out ideas here and get good feedback and the kind of reception that ideas require. So this is, for me, a kind of annual training ground to experiment with my own reading. I was talking with the great Tony Stewart yesterday about the process of intellectual discovery. It's really a kind of a journey that we go on, and we don't know where it's headed. It's like the Lewis and Clark journey. We have a sense of where we're headed, but there are many discoveries, many odd events, many surprises that occur along the way. And I find that the most interesting part of being a scholar is not knowing in advance just where an intellectual journey is going to take me. And so this talk, which I'm giving this morning, has been developed really from a few hints in my reading. I've been reading on the one hand about World War II. I'm working on a large project about the rise and fall of the Third Reich. And of course I've been reading about Thomas Jefferson, and I've been reading about Lewis and Clark, and a whole range of other things. So let me just begin. I hope there's time for questions and that you will give me honest feedback. But again, the subject is being ready when the moment comes. Let me give you two examples to start off with. A friend of mine from my youth in North Dakota is a man named Mike Jacobs. And Mike Jacobs was my mentor. When I was a teenager, I went to work for the local newspaper, the Jenkinson Press, and it was so local, so small a newspaper that I was able to do there anything that I wanted. I was a photographer, and I was a writer, a reporter, and for a summer I ran the presses, and I worked in the darkroom, and I helped to set up the plates, and there was no job except circulation that I wasn't engaged in. Now, that couldn't have happened at the Spokane newspaper or the Seattle newspaper, but in a tiny little backwoods town in North Dakota that was possible. And while I was there as a high school student, this reporter named Mike Jacobs decided to take me on as his tutorial student, I suppose you would say, as his younger, promising reporter. And he would come to the high school and demand that I be allowed to go away from school with him to take photographs of stories that he was writing. So we wandered aimlessly around western North Dakota for a couple of years, and he taught me much of what I know about writing and almost all of what I know about reading. When I think about my own life, I can't imagine it having unfolded successfully without the intervention of this remarkable man. And why he decided to choose me and to help me to intervene in my intellectual and moral development, I don't know. I certainly didn't deserve it. But he chose freely, and it made all the difference in my life. So one of the themes that I want to keep alive as we talk this morning is serendipity, the role of the surprise, the role of grace in the development of human character. At any rate, this eventually ended. I went off to college. Mike Jacobs went off to better things. And in his 30s, he became the editor of the Grand Forks Herald in North Dakota, which is the state's premier daily newspaper. And then nothing much happened. He was a superb editor. He was one of the best regarded North Dakotans. He was seen by everyone in North Dakota as the most gifted journalist in the state. And he was beyond that. He was seen as, in a sense, the spokesman for North Dakota. If a Dutch television crew would come to North Dakota, or for that matter, Tom Brokaw, and say, who do we talk to about what's going on? It would inevitably wind up that Mike Jacobs was the one being interviewed because he was the most articulate, the most knowledgeable North Dakotan. But even so, everyone who knew him and who cared about him began to think maybe his career is not going to be quite so spectacular as we had thought. We've all predicted great things from him, but he seems to be, in a sense, in a plateau as the editor of this well-regarded newspaper. And then the moment came. The great Red River flood of a couple of years ago, you all read about it, the Red River of the North, which flows into Hudson's Bay, inundated parts of Fargo, North Dakota, our largest city, and all of Grand Forks. And the Grand Forks Herald, this newspaper, was located in downtown Grand Forks, so it first flooded out. And then, on the second day of the flood, the Grand Forks Herald, with a number of other buildings in the center of Grand Forks, burned down. So now, think of the problem that Mike Jacobs has. He's the editor of the newspaper. This once-in-500-year disaster is occurring in his community, and his newspaper plant, including the press, have now burned down. Now, a lesser man would have walked away and come back later. But what Mike Jacobs did, he didn't do it alone, and he would be the first to say that he didn't do it alone. But they moved their newspaper office out beyond the floodplain, so 20 miles to the west. They rented a little house. They took advantage of the electronic revolution, and they sent their photographs electronically to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. They sent their stories electronically to the Twin Cities, where they were printed. And then every morning, the newspaper was trucked back up from Minneapolis and St. Paul to Grand Forks, North Dakota, a distance of several hundred miles. And during the great catastrophic Red River flood, the Grand Forks Herald never missed a single edition. Think of it. They didn't miss one printing of their newspaper. They cobbled together this electronic miracle, and they carried on in spite of all of these odds. And more than that, they delivered the newspaper free to anyone who wanted it during the duration of the flood. They ceased to think about money. And they also this is my favorite part of the whole story, they dedicated the front page of the Grand Forks Herald to notices. So you would say, my German Shepherd is missing. If you find it, call me. My favorite Weber grill seems to have floated to Canada. It has a distinguishing mark on the backside. If you see it, return it. I have 12 cats. Only 11 can be accounted for. And so people in Grand Forks would just call in their requests, whatever they were. They could be from ridiculous to the sublime. We have nowhere to sleep. We've lost everything. I'm a shut-in. I can't get my furnace to light again. And so these notices were printed free on the front of the Grand Forks Herald for days. And imagine how important that front page was in the rebinding of this broken community after this catastrophic moment. Well, that's being ready when the moment came, because Mike Jacobs had spent his whole lifetime, 40 years, preparing himself to be resourceful, to think quickly, to make decisions which weren't merely institutional decisions, profit decisions, to write with as much speed and clarity as he could. And in a sense, he was just percolating along during those middle years. And maybe this flood never would have happened. Maybe no big event would ever have occurred in his life, and he simply would have been one of the best regarded newspaper publishers in the upper Midwest. But the fact is, this moment did come, and unlike some others who might have been in his position, he was ready. And because he was ready, an extraordinary thing occurred instead of an average one. And for that, the Grand Forks Herald won the Pulitzer Prize for public service. And Mike Jacobs was on ABC News Nightline, and I remember watching it from my expatriate North Dakota home in Reno, Nevada. And I thought, this is why we spend those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours doing our work with as much discipline as we can. Because at some point the moment is probably going to come, and when it comes, you have to be ready. Now, if Mike were here, he would be saying, the credit belongs to the community. The credit belongs to the institution. There are other people involved. We can take that point. But if he hadn't been there, that newspaper wouldn't have been published every day and wouldn't have been distributed free and wouldn't have become the binding force of the reconnection of Grand Forks after this disaster. Let me give you a second example, which is equally compelling. I don't know this one personally. Most of what I know comes from the books that I read. This is from Ian Fraser's recent study of Indian life in America today called On the Res. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Most of it is about the Great Plains rather than the Mountain West. So not so much about the Nez Perce or the Shoshone, but much more about the Cheyenne and the Lakota. This is a story about a young Indian girl who was a basketball player on the Pine Ridge Reservation. This was 1988. And her name was Sue Ann Crow Dog. And she was one of those extraordinary young women who becomes the center of the high school basketball team and galvanizes a whole community. And basketball in Indian America is a bit like basketball in Black America. It's not only an expression of youthful exuberance, but it's also, in a sense, a path out from the most difficult conditions of reservation life. So she was the very epitome of youthful excellence. And although she wasn't the captain or the center of her basketball team, she was, in a sense, its moral center. And this team, the Pine Ridge girls basketball team, went off to the Rapid City area in the Black Hills. So they went off the reservation to play a game in Leeds, South Dakota. And when they got there, the crowd, equally attached to its team, but it's an all-white team there, were hostile to the Indians. And there is, as I'm sure you know, an enormous amount of border town race tension in Indian America. And so when the Pine Ridge girls began to be announced to come out from the locker room onto the floor, the crowd began to make mock Indian sounds and tomahawk chops and to ridicule the native players in every way they could. And when these girls came out onto the floor itself, the fans were shouting things like squaw and gut eater, and others were screaming, "Where's the cheese?" which is a way of saying you're all on government welfare waiting for the government cheese distribution at the beginning of the month. And so this jeering, hostile crowd of hundreds are making life uncomfortable for the Lady Thorpes, as they're called, from the Pine Ridge as they walk out onto the floor. And the captain and center of the team said, "I can't do it. I can't go out there because these girls are terrified. And it is a potentially dangerous moment, certainly a highly uncomfortable one." So Sue Ann Crow Dog said, "I'll go." And she walked out of the locker room and onto the floor in this densely populated, you can just sense the heat in this auditorium. And she walked to the center, and she took her letter jacket off of her back, and she draped it over her shoulders. And then she did something she had never done before. She did a Lakota shawl dance, a traditional Lakota woman's dance. And she danced, the crowd was by now silent. She danced in a circle in the center of this gymnasium. And when she was 3 or 4 seconds into it, she began to do a song, to chant in the Lakota manner. And the crowd, which had been extremely hostile and contemptuous, was silent, and suddenly they began to cheer. And they stood up, and they gave her a standing ovation. Now, is that a great moment? Think of what it took for Sue Ann Crow Dog to do this. I can't think of that story without thinking that there is a form of moral greatness which comes from some source that we can't understand. Because this girl was a fairly badly educated young Indian woman from a highly dysfunctional family on a highly dysfunctional reservation. And her mastery was this game. She wasn't a dancer, she wasn't a cultural leader, she wasn't any of these things. She was a ball player. And suddenly, in this terrible moment, she's touched by some kind of grace, and she gives this shawl dance, and she turns around a crowd of hundreds from open hostility to open admiration. Well, the story is one of the great stories about being ready when the moment comes. She went on to become, she scored the winning basket in the state finals and won the trophy for the Lady Thorpes of the Pine Ridge. And then the story ends, as so many Indian stories end. She died tragically just a short time later in a car accident. She was going off to college. Her mother was driving. They had a one-car accident on the interstates of South Dakota, and she was dead before she was 20 years old. But a Sue Ann Crow Dog educational center and foundation have been opened on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and her memory lives on as an inspiration to young people that there are paths of greatness that lead away from the dysfunction of a place like the Pine Ridge, which is the poorest county in the United States. The poorest county we have in America is in South Dakota, and it's on the Sioux Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So those are two stories about being ready, and they're very different stories. Mike Jacobs was ready because he had spent many years mastering his craft and examining what leadership can be. Sue Ann Crodog was ready because she was touched by the divine, because she had courage, and a certain lyricism just, in a sense, popped out of her at that moment. Let's turn to Thomas Jefferson. I really began thinking about this with respect to Jefferson. Jefferson was a Virginian. He was a shy man. He was shy to the point of debilitating shyness. He had a slight speech impediment. He was not in the war. He had no martial instincts. He had no capacity to think of himself as a soldier. He was aloof. He didn't spend time in taverns or with the average people of Virginia. He lived on a mountaintop. He lived in a kind of fortress of solitude. He was a self-styled intellectual. He was an extremely private man, and he didn't particularly have any ambitions to be a public servant. So if ever there was a set of qualities that wouldn't be expected to lead to greatness, this was that set. But he's sent as an alternate up to the Continental Congress in 1775. And then he goes back as a regular member of the Continental Congress in 1776. But typical of Jefferson, in the spring of 1776, when the revolution is beginning to gain some momentum, Jefferson is at home. Jefferson has the very odd quality of disappearing at important moments and going home. Now, he does this for good reason, and I'll come back to that. But he's at home. His wife is pregnant. His mother suddenly becomes sick at the end of March of 1776 and dies within 2 hours. So he's been lingering at Monticello. With great reluctance, he finally decides it's his duty to go back to Philadelphia to the Continental Congress. He gets there in April. He gets there, and just a few days later, he's appointed to write the Declaration of Independence. So he came that close to missing it by staying at Monticello. But he gets there and he gets the assignment, and you know what happened. Jefferson sat down and he wrote out the most important document in American history, possibly the most important document in the history of human freedom. He wrote it in one day, and he revised it a little bit. But essentially he wrote it, I use this not in a cynical sense, but essentially he wrote it off the top of his head. Think of that. That he was asked to write this document, and he thought, all right. He puts a piece of paper in front of himself, and he writes it out, and there it is. And effectively, it didn't have to be changed at all to become the most important document in the history of liberty. How did this happen? How did Jefferson get the assignment? And why did he do so well? Those are really interesting questions. Well, he got the assignment because he had a reputation for being a student of liberty, that he had understood the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights in Britain and the whole struggle for liberty in the ancient and early modern world. So he already had a reputation for being a deep scholar of the thing that Congress needed for this moment. This wasn't about trade or tariffs or war. This was about liberty and natural law. And that was his field, in a sense. But he also had spent years mastering his prose style. And nobody has an easy prose style by gift of God. If you have a good prose style, it is the result of hundreds and hundreds of hours of writing prose. And in Jefferson's case, actually imitating the prose of the people he most respected, Addison and Steele, Dr. Johnson, Alexander Pope, etc. So when the moment came for Jefferson, he got the assignment for two reasons. First of all, he knew what needed to be said, and everyone recognized that, even though he had just arrived. And secondly, he knew how to say it, and everyone recognized that too. This came about because between the ages of 12 and 33, Jefferson literally read about 12 hours per day. So talk about being ready. Of course he was ready. He read 12 hours a day for 20 years. Imagine how much was stored in his brain. Now, Patrick Henry was another great man. He never read anything. He gave great speeches because he had charisma and the capacity to think on his feet and to speak extemporaneously. That wasn't Jefferson's mastery. There are many different types. Jefferson's mastery came from deep, endless preparation. And so it is literally the case that Thomas Jefferson had read virtually all of the great texts of the Enlightenment by the time the assignment came to him. And he simply distilled that massive learning into a few sentences that changed the world and changed it forever. His strength wasn't oratory, his strength wasn't war, his strength wasn't ambition. His strength was this. And somehow he moved towards his own strength. He didn't try to do what he couldn't do. And somehow the people around him recognized that that was his strength. And so these two things came together, and Jefferson changed the world. And after that, he was able to write his own ticket, and he essentially surfed at the top of the American power structure for the rest of his life and went on to change the world in much more interesting ways. So Jefferson's greatness was preparation. It's like the clarinetist that you hear who gives a solo at a concert, and you think, my God, how could anyone play the clarinet this well? But of course, if you thought about it for a minute, you would know that clarinetist has spent years and years and years and years of her life alone in a room with the clarinet. And so what you see is the very tip of a pyramid that extends endlessly in that person's life. And that's what Jefferson did. So we think the Declaration of Independence is this incredible document. But actually, there's nothing incredible about it at all. It's the result of mental discipline. And Jefferson's friend, John Page, said he had the ability to tear himself away from any pleasure to return to his books. That Jefferson was unseducible by beer or by dancing or by flirtation. Jefferson, or even horses, which Jefferson truly loved. That Jefferson's commitment to mastery was so great that he could always tear himself away from his closest friends. I'm sure that annoyed them, but he did it. People say to me all the time, why do our leaders today seem so pitiful compared to the leaders then? Well, the answer is in this story, without moving from the sublime to the ridiculous. Can you imagine either William Jefferson Clinton or George W. Bush spending 12 hours a day reading? That's not their discipline. That's not how they have spent their lives. So it'll be interesting to see if the moment comes for the current president, what he brings to that moment. Let me turn from Jefferson, who is so interesting. Well, let me say one more word about Jefferson. He had intellectual courage, there's no question. If ever a man had intellectual courage, it was Jefferson. If you want American secular scripture, the sort of the documents that tell us what America's ideals are and what we were expected to be as a republic, you invariably turn to Jefferson. He is the muse or the Holy Spirit of the American experiment. Jefferson had intellectual courage. It's not quite clear that he had moral courage. And let me just give you one example. In 1814, a fellow Virginian by the name of Coles, Edward Coles, wrote to Jefferson with an idea to end slavery. And Cole's view was that Virginia was no place to try to end slavery, that he, Coles, had just inherited slaves from his family. He was going to take his slaves into Illinois and then free them. And not only free them, but buy farms for them and supervise them and have training programs for them. And he had this elaborate scheme to carry slaves out of the worst scene of enslavement to a freer soil, to the soil of the Ohio Valley, and there to have an experiment in not only manumission of slaves, but absorption of black people as fellow citizens and productive farmers. He wrote to Jefferson, because Jefferson all of his life had advocated the abolition of slavery. And he said, "You are this great man. If ever there's a respected American, it's you. If you put your weight behind this proposal, hundreds of others would follow, and we might solve this grave problem, slavery." And Jefferson wrote back to him one of the most disappointing letters in his works of 22,000 letters. Jefferson said, "I'm too old. I'm not probably as well regarded as you think. I don't think your scheme will work. I urge you not to try it. Stay here in Virginia and fight for abolition here." And it seems to me that on this question, the question of race, Jefferson had intellectual courage, but not moral courage. Because moral courage is the capacity to do what you know is going to get you in deep trouble because you know it has to be done. It's Rosa Parks on that bus, tired because she has been working all day, and saying, "I'm not moving to the back of the bus." And she must have known that she was opening a world of troubles for herself and her people, but she did it. I'm going to give you an example in a few moments of the greatest 20th century instance of this. Mother Teresa, a creature of enormous moral courage. Jefferson had intellectual courage. It's not clear that he had the same kind of moral courage, and I think that Jefferson's long-term reputation as history unfolds will weaken because of this. That the great men and women are the ones who have moral courage, and intellectual courage, although important, is not as important. Just as Sue Ann Crodog had moral courage, but probably her intellect, like most of us, was not particularly highly developed at that point in her life. Well, let me turn just quickly. I don't want to run out of time. I want to turn to Robert Oppenheimer and then to Martin Niemöller. And then I have some sort of concluding advice about developing readiness. Robert Oppenheimer was the father of the atomic bomb. He was ready in two ways. First of all, he was ready to take on that project when all of the physics of atomic fission and quantum mechanics was unfolding just ahead of the building of the atomic bomb. And so this wasn't the case of a rocket. A rocket uses physics that's as old as Isaac Newton. But the physics of the atomic devices were just being discovered in advance of the engineering of those devices. So lots of different scientific discoveries were coalescing in the desert of New Mexico in the period between 1942 and 1945. And when the news that the atom could be split was first announced to the world, Robert Oppenheimer was a professor of theoretical physics at Berkeley. And according to his students, the news came, Robert Oppenheimer announced it to his class. It had just come over the wire that the atom could be split under certain conditions. And he immediately went to the chalkboard in Berkeley and calculated the amount of fissionable material that would be required to produce a bomb. So the minute the atom was split, Robert Oppenheimer figured this can be used to make a bomb. And he was interested in it not because he liked bombs, but because he hated Nazism, and he knew that Nazism had to be stopped. It was his conviction that Hitler, if he won the war, would exterminate Jews, Slavs, homosexuals, blacks, everyone he disliked, and that Hitler had to be stopped. So he gets the assignment. He gets the assignment because he's ready, because he knows quantum mechanics, and because he knows what it will take. And so he convinces Leslie Groves, who is the the director of the project, on very short acquaintance, Oppenheimer, without seeking the job, is just asked, what would it take to build this device? And he talks about it in such a way that Leslie Groves realizes this is the man. So he becomes the director of this project in Los Alamos. He does it. It comes in under budget and on schedule. It was an incredibly complex engineering feat in addition to a nightmare of personnel management because the war is going on. All the great minds are doing something else, radar, ballistics, submarines. Now Oppenheimer has special need to draw the best minds that he can to this place in the desert to work on a project that probably won't ever be made in time for the war. And so the logistics, the personnel management themselves required genius, and he had it. And you all know that it worked, that all of the engineering hurdles were overcome, the fissionable material was made. Eventually a test occurred in July of 1945. The test occurred on July 16th at Alamogordo, New Mexico, and it worked. It was a plutonium implosion device. It was detonated at dawn on that stormy day. And when the device worked, the mushroom cloud rose to 38,000 feet. This is the Earth's first mushroom cloud. A girl who had been blind since birth was a musician and was being driven from one village 100 miles away to another. She had never seen anything, but she saw the blast. It was so bright. A shepherd 15 miles away from the atomic blast was knocked off of his cot by the potency of the explosion. This mushroom cloud lifted, and two events occurred. Enrico Fermi was there, the greatest of the theoretical physicists, and Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, and they were standing together. And Enrico Fermi, just before the bomb went off, thought, I wonder how powerful it will be. So he took a sheet of paper, and he tore it up into tiny little bits, and when the moment came, when the detonation occurred, he dropped this piece of paper, and then he calculated how far it had drifted, and by doing so was able within minutes to determine that the bomb had been about 20 kilotons in potency. So he's a pure scientist. He thinks, I'll do a little experiment, determine how powerful this thing was, and he just makes it up on the spot. And he's right, he was within 2 kilotons of accuracy on this device. Now there's pure science at work. I just love that anecdote. That's Enrico Fermi. He was ready in his own way. Robert Oppenheimer was ready in his profound way. And that's what makes him a much more interesting human being than Enrico Fermi. Because Oppenheimer watched this go up, and in a strange way, until that second, he had never once thought about the implications of what he had done. Until that second, he had thought about gun mechanisms and plutonium and uranium processing and about how to keep these egomaniacal physicists from killing each other. All he had thought about until that moment was, can this be done? Can I do it? Can we bring all these resources together to make this happen? But he hadn't thought morally about it until then. But the minute it went up, his mind went back to his training, his hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of reading. And his mind flashed to the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu sacred text, and out of his mouth, without his even intending it, came the words, I am become death, the shatterer of worlds. He was ready because his moral character had been fully formed by decades of hard reading and reflection and conversation. And more than that, one reason that Robert Oppenheimer wasn't, like the other physicists, a naive believer in the power of physics, one reason that he became a philosopher at the end of his life and wrestled endlessly with the implications of the nuclear age is because he had learned to think out of the box. He was clearly trained in the Western tradition, Dante, T.S. Eliot, but you see that he had at some point in his life deliberately decided to break out of the Western tradition and to sample the Eastern tradition. And he had learned Sanskrit, one of the world's oldest and most difficult languages, in order to read the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. And so he had done the hard intellectual work of preparing himself to see another tradition, fundamentally different from his own. And that, I think, that willingness to take intellectual risks also governed his willingness to make the bomb, but more importantly, his willingness to jump out of that box and become a critic of the very thing that he had mastered. And he spent the last 20 years of his life trying to convince the world that the nuclear discovery meant that we must now change our foreign policies, must change the hearts of mankind, of humankind, to overcome the propensity for war that would lead, he said, in the Third World War to nuclear annihilation. So he was strangely unready until the moment came, but when the moment came, he was profoundly ready because he had done that hard work as a young intellectual. Let me turn finally to Martin Niemöller. I've been reading about World War II. Of course, everyone knows the famous quote of Martin Niemöller, which I'll conclude the program with, but I had not ever bothered to find out anything about him until I began working on this project on World War II. Martin Niemöller was a Lutheran pastor in Hitler's Germany. He had been a highly decorated World War I submarine captain. In fact, he wrote an autobiography just at the time that Hitler rose, called From U-Boat to the Pulpit. He was an ardent German nationalist. And in fact, in the early years, he was pro-Hitler. And at the end of his autobiography, From U-Boat to the Pulpit, he actually praised Hitler almost unambiguously and said Hitler was bringing about a national restoration in Germany. So Hitler's Nazis loved Martin Niemöller because here was this highly decorated war hero, this moral authority, one of the leaders of the Lutheran Church, who was also pro-Nazi. But Niemöller's mind was open. And 2 years later, he realized that the Nazis were an unspeakable disaster for Christianity and for humanity. And he slowly began to distance himself from Nazism. And he gave sermons in his church in a suburb of Berlin, which were increasingly critical of the Nazi regime and even critical of Hitler. Now think of what he was doing. It's one thing to denounce racism in Mississippi. But when you denounce Nazism, you might disappear in the night. Hitler's solution to criticism was death, torture, annihilation. So being a critic of the American injustices is one thing. You're probably going to live. It might not be comfortable. But being a critic of Nazism was almost certainly, in a sense, a suicide mission. So Niemöller's moral courage was greater, in my opinion, even than Martin Luther King's moral courage, and his was vast. But he did it. And let me just find a couple of things that he said. In 1934, on November 8th, he held a rally at his church. The rally was forbidden by the Nazis. He held it anyway. Gestapo members were patrolling the periphery. 20,000 Germans showed up. It was the largest rally in Germany that was not a Nazi rally during that period. And at this rally, he gave the concluding speech, and he said this. Just hear all of the moral courage in this simple sentence. For us, it is a question of which master the German Protestants are going to serve, Christ or another. Well, we all know who the other was. He said this in front of 20,000 people with the Gestapo recording it. And then in 1937, by now he was emaciated from, partly from rationing, but mostly from worry and hard work. He had the look of a martyr. He could barely stand up. He had been beaten and interrogated. 700 other Lutheran pastors had disappeared altogether in arrests following this giant rally. All of his sermons were attended by members of the SS and the Gestapo. And he gave what almost everyone agreed would be his final sermon on June 27th, 1937. 3 days later, he was arrested, and he disappeared into the Nazi gulag. But this is what he said. It reminds me of what Martin Luther King said just before his assassination. He said, "We have no more thought of using our own powers to escape the arm of the authorities than had the apostles of old. No more are we ready to keep silent at man's behest when God commands us to speak, for it is and must be the case that we must obey God rather than man." And so really all he was trying to do was to stand up for the integrity of Christianity against its deliberate perversion by the Nazi regime. 3 days after this sermon, he was arrested. He was tried by one of the people's courts, which were basically kangaroo courts. He was acquitted of one charge but found guilty of another, but he had already served, during the period of the trial, he had served the entire sentence, and so he was to be released. The judge ordered him released. Even this pro-Nazi judge had no choice under their perverted due process but to release Niemöller. His family was in tears of happiness that he was going to be released, and as he walked out of the docket on that day, the Gestapo arrested him for protective custody, and he was taken off eventually to Dachau. Surprisingly, he lived. He lived until 30 years after the war. He was not one of those killed in the last days of the war. The Nazis killed many of their critics in the last days of the war because they didn't want them to live to speak, but somehow Niemöller survived. But imagine the price he paid for his moral courage. And to give you a sense of it, let me just read to you the new Nazi platform on Christianity. This was written by Alfred Rosenberg, the so-called Nazi philosopher during the war. This is the official Nazi position on Christianity. There's a 30-point program. I'll just read you a few of them. Number 5, Rosenberg writes, for the Nazis, the National Church is determined to exterminate irrevocably the strange and foreign Christian faiths imported into Germany in the ill-omened year 800. So the Nazi Party went on record as deliberately planning to exterminate German Christianity. The National Church has no scribes, pastors, chaplains, or priests, but only National Reich orators are to speak in them. So the Nazis intended to turn the church into a speaker's bureau for its own propaganda. Listen to this. This is Principle 14. This should remind you of events that occurred not so far from here. It has been decided that the Führer's Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography written in prison, it has been decided that the Führer's Mein Kampf is the greatest of all human documents. It not only contains the greatest truths, but it embodies the purest and truest ethics from the present and future life of our planet. Number 18, the National Church will clear away from its altars all crucifixes, Bibles, and pictures of saints. Number 19, on the altars of Reich churches, there must be nothing but a copy of Mein Kampf, and to the left of it, a sword. And number 30, on the day of its foundation, the Christian cross must be removed from all churches, and it must be superseded by the only unconquerable symbol, the swastika. So the Nazis were quite clear about what they intended. And Martin Niemöller, virtually alone, there are 30 million Protestants in Germany, virtually alone stood up to this regime. Virtually all of the pastors, all good men, I'm sure, found a way to accommodate Nazism and to keep their mouths shut. But Niemöller stood up and said, in the tradition of the great Luther, "Here I stand, I can do no other. We must serve either God or some other master." And he paid the ultimate price. He spent the best years of his life in a concentration camp for it. But talk about moral courage. That's moral courage in the profoundest sense, because when I started reading about Martin Niemöller, I thought, is there anything that I would stand up for when I knew that the Gestapo was going to arrest me and torture me and probably kill me? And my answer to myself was no. There's probably nothing that I would have the moral courage to stand up for. Now, we don't know until the moment comes, but I have very deep doubts. I see myself almost certainly as one of the silent ones, and that really disappoints me. But it also reminds me of what greatness there is in moral courage, what greatness there is in Mother Teresa, whom you will soon meet, and what greatness there is in Martin Niemöller, people who, not like Jefferson, just talk about it beautifully, but people who put their bodies in front of death and say, I can do no other. I can't be a fully developed human being and acquiesce in this madness, this evil, this unspeakable practice. So, let me give my advice and then I'll close. If you want to be ready, and this, as Tony said at the beginning, this is particularly for young people, although not necessarily. We all still have time. The number one way to be ready when the moment comes is to have done your homework. And I'm not talking about keep up with the demands made upon you by your culture. I'm talking about taking on almost impossible demands for yourself and then living up to them. You know, on Saturday morning when you are absolutely tired and all you want to do is read the newspaper, going back to the gym and doing 5 hours of gymnastics, or going into your room and playing that scratchy violin again and again and again until you get it right. But mastery is the number one coefficient of greatness. It always looks so easy. I forget who it was who said, the harder I work, the more luck I seem to have. But it looks easy. When you see Michael Jordan, you think he's an anti-gravity machine. But no, he's a man who jumped and jumped and jumped all of his life until he became the most gifted basketball player of all time. That's a form of mastery. So you must be willing to gut it out with the hard work. Secondly, you must have a sense of timing. What if Sue Ann Crow Dog had gone out there and done her fancy dance and they had only jeered more loudly? She had to have some sense. There was some grace involved here, some serendipity, some sense of timing that she knew that she could pull this off, that her mastery would express itself and would turn this crowd. Because there's nothing worse than failing when you make this move. I made a short list this morning. I woke up thinking about this. John Adams was famous for this. John Adams believed that he would be the great one from the Revolution because he is the one who argued for the resolution of independence on July 2nd. We resolved our independence from Great Britain on July 2nd, and John Adams wrote a very, very funny letter home to his wife, Abigail Adams, and he said, he didn't boast about himself much, but he did say that he had single-handedly brought this about. But he was really wanting to talk about, he was really being patriotic. His ego and his patriotism were in equal measures. And so he said, I did this, and if I hadn't done this, it wouldn't have been done, and for months I've been working on this, and now it's borne fruit. And then he said, for the rest of time, on July 2nd of every year, there will be picnics, and there will be fireworks, and there will be patriotic speeches, and people will gather and remember that I resolved independence on this day. Well, he was sort of right and sort of wrong. And when he discovered later in life that Jefferson's document had trumped Adams' leadership, it really upset him. And he actually wrote to Jefferson at the end of his life and said, "You ran away with the revolution. I did all the work. You took all the credit." Timing is essential. There was a doctor who wanted to go on the Lewis and Clark expedition that Lewis met in the Ohio Valley on his way down that river in August of 1803. Lewis said, would you like to come on the expedition? We need a doctor. And the man said, great, I'd love to come. And they needed a doctor. If you've read the journals, they needed a doctor. The man slept in the next day and missed the boat. He missed his chance to be the doctor on the Lewis and Clark expedition because he overslept. Imagine if it might be the Lewis and Clark and Smith expedition if he had awakened. How could you sleep through that? But he did. William Clark in southwestern Montana decided that he finally was going to have his moment. He was going to discover the Shoshone Indians, not Lewis. Lewis had always made sure that Lewis, discovered the important things. So Clark insists, all right, this time I'm doing it. But he started too soon. His timing was off. And he was 200 miles in front of the Shoshone. And so he went off in a big heroic way, and his feet got infected, and he had to stop. And Lewis caught up with him, and there was poor Clark with his blistered feet. And Lewis said, okay, I'll do it. And so Lewis went to do it. And Clark really was upset. The only time in the journals that he is clearly upset was then. And he says in them, I could have done this if my feet had been okay. But he was premature. His timing was off, and Lewis's timing was sure. Lewis had a better sense of timing. And so on. You can make countless examples of people who weren't ready when the moment came, or people who misjudged the moment. So maybe this is luck. It's certainly serendipity, but it might be the genius of understanding the timing of events too. The other thing that I should quickly say is that you need a sense of yourself. Thomas Jefferson had a sense of who he was. He had no doubts about who he was. That matters. Robert Oppenheimer had a sense of himself. He knew who he was. And people always abused him for studying Sanskrit and reading Dante and quoting Eliot and so on. But he said, no, I don't want to be a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. I want to be a complete man. And so he had a sense of who he was, and that's what enabled him to have the confidence of his own convictions when his moment came. Now, Meriwether Lewis, I won't go into it, but Meriwether Lewis did not have a fully developed character. So he was brilliant. It was an extraordinary act of leadership, but he was a broken man, and the fractures in his character began to widen in his famous voyage out here. By the time he got back to St. Louis in September of 1806, he was pretty broken up, and he committed suicide 3 years later because he wasn't comfortable in his own skin. And mastery, leadership, being ready when the moment comes, means that you have to be grounded. You have to know who you are and what your capacities are and where your strengths are and where they aren't. And Lewis didn't fully know that. And in his famous birthday meditation, written not very far from here in August 18th of 1805, Lewis says, I'll quickly quote it, he says, today I have celebrated my 31st birthday, and I conceive that I had in all human probability now existed about half the time I am to remain in this sublunary world. Translation, I'm in middle age. He said, I reflected that I had as yet done little, very little indeed, to advance the happiness of the human race or to increase the knowledge of future generations. I viewed with regret the many hours I have spent in indolence, and now sorely feel the want of that information which those hours would have given me had they been judiciously employed. In other words, I'm here and I'm not ready. Because he's not Jefferson. If Jefferson were there, Jefferson would know every plant, every animal. Jefferson was so well educated that he would have brought his own encyclopedia in his brain to the event. And Lewis, who has a very poor education, says, I'm not ready. I don't know enough. I'm not prepared. So we see him as a national hero. He saw himself as an inadequate man. So he wasn't ready. He hadn't done the hard work, and he wasn't grounded. And those two things hurt him and eventually led to his suicide. The final thing I will say about being ready is you need to look in the mirror. You need to let other people help you decide who you are, because you might think that you are a poet when everyone around you might think she's not a poet, but she's a great dancer. And you need to allow your intimates, your friends, your family, your lovers, your ministers, your mentors, serve as mirrors to help you decide who you are, because we're very poor self-reflectors. And we need the mirroring of those who wish us well. And if we don't look into that mirror, we almost always misunderstand our greatness and our potential. So let me close by just quoting from Martin Niemöller and from John Donne, because I do finally believe that being ready is great if you're Michael Jordan. It's great if you're Martina Navratilova. It's great if you win the middle school spelling bee. It's great if you win the Nobel Prize for physics. But it's greater if you're Martin Luther King. And it's greater if you're Mother Teresa. And it's, I think, greatest of all if you're Martin Niemöller, if you have the moral mastery to know when to stand up and how to make that stand one that changes the world, even if it means that you are now on a fast path to death and torture. So you all know what Niemöller said, and it seems to me it could be the motto of the humanities. He said towards the end of his life, in Germany, they came first for the communists, and I did not speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time there was no one left to speak up. What an extraordinary thing that he said, and how we forget it all of the time. It's not my problem. And then John Donne. I spent most of the first years of my life working on John Donne. John Donne is the poet preacher of Elizabethan England, and Donne was the greatest Anglican minister of his age, and he wrote 10 volumes of sermons which are amongst the most beautiful sermons in the history of Christianity, but also amongst the most beautiful passages of English in English literature. And you all know some part of this. This is Donne's most famous single passage. It's not from a sermon, it's from his devotions. But he was ready because he had read all of Augustine and all of Jerome, and he had read the Bible in Latin and in Greek, and he had read the history of scholasticism, and he had read all of the history of the classical world. And so he was as well educated as Jefferson, maybe more so. And when his moment came, it wasn't a moral moment, but it was a writing moment about the commonality of the human experience. John Donne said this. He's talking about the fact that in England, in London, when someone died in an age before newspapers, the way that it was communicated to the parish was the church bells tolled in a certain way. So that if you heard the bells sounding in a certain way, you knew immediately someone died. And then you would send somebody to find out who it was. So that was the news flash that there had been a death in the parish. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of churches in London. So the bells are tolling all the time. And John Donne said, "Who casts not up his eye to the sun when it rises? But who can take off his eye from a comet when that breaks out? Who bends not his ear to any bell which upon any occasion rings? But who can take off his ear from that bell which is passing a piece of himself out of this world? No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Every man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." That's moral greatness. Thank you very much. It's too late.
I am sure that you agree with me that this great address has inspired you. Unfortunately, there will not be time for questions. In 5 minutes, we'll be having live music to welcome Mother Teresa. We'll start again in 5 minutes. Thank you again, Dr. Jenkinson.